My name is Jonathan, and I learned the hardest lesson of my life at my father's funeral. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and sometimes the people closest to you are the ones sharpening the knife. My father, Richard, was a self-made man who built his wealth from nothing: real estate, investments, a sharp mind for business that never quit, even when his body started to fail. He raised me to value honesty, integrity, and hard work. He taught me that family was everything. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, and Vanessa cried harder than anyone at the funeral. She stood at the graveside in a black dress that looked expensive, tears streaming down her face, her hand clutching her mother's arm like she might collapse without support. People whispered about how devoted she'd been, how she'd spent the last 6 months caring for him, how lucky Richard had been to have a daughter like her by his side. I stood across from her, dried and numb, watching her performance and feeling something cold settle in my chest, because I knew the truth. I knew that while I'd been 3 states away managing my own business, trying to keep my life together while my father withered from cancer, Vanessa had been circling him like a vulture. I'd seen it during my visits: the way she hovered, the way she controlled access to him, the way she positioned herself as the indispensable caregiver, while subtly pushing me to the margins. But I hadn't known the extent of it. Not yet. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. My father's attorney, Martin Reeves, had called me personally to confirm the date. His voice had been careful, measured, like he was weighing every word. "Jonathan," he'd said, "I think you should be prepared for some surprises." I'd asked him what he meant, but he'd deflected, said he couldn't discuss specifics until the reading. But something in his tone had made my stomach tighten, had made me start asking questions I should have asked months ago. I started by calling my father's bank. I was listed as a secondary contact on several of his accounts, had been for years, a precaution he'd set up when his health first started declining. The customer service representative was polite but firm. She couldn't give me detailed information without proper authorization, but she could confirm whether the accounts were active. They weren't. 3 of his major accounts had been closed in the past 4 months. I felt the blood drain from my face. Closed? By who? "I can't provide those details, sir, but the accounts were closed by someone with the power of attorney authorization." Power of attorney. My father had granted someone power of attorney, and it hadn't been me. I hung up and immediately called Martin Reeves. This time, I didn't ask politely. I demanded answers. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, "Vanessa has been handling your father's financial affairs for the past 6 months. He granted her power of attorney last October when his condition worsened." The room tilted. "He what?" "I advised against it," Martin said quickly. "I told him it should be you, or at the very least, that there should be safeguards. But he trusted her. She convinced him she was protecting his assets, managing his care costs, ensuring everything was handled properly. And was it?" My voice was shaking now. "Was everything handled properly?" Another pause, longer this time. "Come to my office tomorrow, Jonathan, before the will reading. There are things you need to see." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, in my father's house, my house now. I supposed, though it didn't feel like it, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how this had happened, how my father, sharp and careful and suspicious of everyone, had handed over control of his entire fortune to a woman he'd known less than 10 years, a woman who wasn't even his blood. But I knew how, because Vanessa was good. She was patient, manipulative, calculating. She'd spent years playing the role of devoted stepdaughter, ingratiating herself, building trust. And when my father got sick, when he was vulnerable and scared and desperate, she'd strike. Martin Reeves' office smelled like old books and expensive furniture polish, the kind of place that had been around for generations. He was waiting for me when I arrived, a stack of folders on his desk, his expression grim. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened the first folder and slid it across to me. "Bank statements," he said, "from your father's primary accounts. Look at the dates." I scanned the pages, my eyes catching on transaction after transaction, large withdrawals, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and cashier's checks made out to various entities. It started small, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, but as the months progressed, the amounts grew. 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 in a single transaction. She was draining him, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Systematically, Martin confirmed. Over 6 months, Vanessa moved approximately $1.8 million out of your father's accounts. Some of it went to what she claimed were medical expenses, private nurses, experimental treatments, equipment, but the numbers don't add up. I've reviewed the actual medical bills, and they account for maybe a quarter of what she withdrew. Where did the rest go? Martin opened another folder. Her personal accounts, investment accounts in her name, a property she purchased in Florida, a car, luxury purchases that she disguised as estate expenses. I felt sick, not just because of the money, but because of what it meant. While my father was dying, while he was weak and in pain, and trusting her to care for him, she'd been robbing him blind. Why didn't you stop her? I asked, and I heard the anger in my own voice. I tried, Martin said, and for the first time, I saw real frustration in his expression. I called your father multiple times. I sent letters. I even drove out to the house to speak with him directly. But Vanessa controlled access. She screened his calls, monitored his mail, and was always in the room when I visited. And when I did manage to speak with him alone, he defended her, said she was taking care of everything, that I was worrying unnecessarily. He didn't know what she was doing. No, Martin agreed. I don't believe he did. She was careful. She moved money in ways that looked legitimate on the surface. Checks written for medical supplies or nursing care or estate maintenance. Your father was too sick to review the statements himself, and he trusted her to handle it. I sat back in my chair, trying to process it all. $1.8 million, gone, stolen by a woman who'd cried at his funeral like she'd actually loved him. What about the will? I asked. Did she tamper with that too? Martin's expression shifted, and I saw something that looked almost like satisfaction. That's the one thing she couldn't touch. Your father's will was drafted years ago, before he even met Catherine. It's ironclad, and I've had it locked in my safe the entire time. Vanessa had power of attorney over his financial accounts, but that authority ended the moment he died. She has no claim to his estate under the will, so she gets nothing. Under the will, she receives a token bequest, $50,000, which your father specified years ago for any stepchildren. Everything else goes to you. I should have felt relief, victory, even, but all I felt was hollow, because the money Vanessa had already taken, $1.8 million, was gone, spent, hidden, moved beyond reach. Can we get it back? I asked, but Martin hesitated. Legally, what she did constitutes financial elder abuse and theft. With the documentation I've compiled, we can file criminal charges and civil suits. But Jonathan, you need to understand this will be a long, expensive fight, and there's no guarantee we'll recover everything. I don't care, I said, and I meant it. I want her to face consequences. I want everyone who cried at that funeral to know what she really is. Martin nodded slowly. Then we proceed. But first, the will reading. Let's see how she reacts when she realizes the game is over. The days before the will reading felt like preparing for battle. Martin and I worked methodically, building our case, compiling evidence, and preparing for every possible scenario. We subpoenaed additional bank records, credit card statements, and property records. We interviewed my father's doctors and nurses, his accountant, and his financial advisor. A picture emerged of a woman who had systematically isolated my father, controlled information, and exploited his trust for her own gain. The most damning evidence came from my father's longtime accountant, Gerald, who'd worked with him for 30 years. He'd been frozen out in the final months, his calls unreturned, his access revoked. When we showed him the bank statements, he went pale. Richard would never have approved these withdrawals, he said, his hands shaking as he reviewed the documents. He was meticulous about his money. Every dollar had a purpose, a plan. He gestured at the pages. This is chaos. This is theft. Gerald provided detailed records of my father's actual financial situation before Vanessa's involvement, assets, investments, and cash reserves. The contrast was staggering. In 6 months, she'd depleted accounts that had taken my father decades to build. We also discovered that Vanessa had been pressuring my father to change his will. Martin found draft documents in his files, proposals that Vanessa had brought to him multiple times. In them, she was listed as the primary beneficiary, with me receiving only a fraction of the estate. My father had refused to sign them, had told Martin repeatedly that the original will stood, but Vanessa hadn't given up. In the weeks before my father's death, she'd contacted 2 other attorneys, trying to convince them to draft a new will behind Martin's back. Both had refused when they learned she had power of attorney, but wasn't the named beneficiary. It raised too many red flags. I also started talking to people who'd known Vanessa before she came into our lives, neighbors from her old apartment, former coworkers, ex-boyfriends. A pattern emerged. She was charming at first, attentive and caring, but she always had an angle. She'd borrowed money and never paid it back. She'd stolen from previous employers. She'd convinced one ex to put her name on his car title, then sold it and kept the money. She was a predator, and my father had been her biggest score. The night before the will reading, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father, about the last conversation we'd had. He'd been weak, barely conscious, but he'd squeezed my hand and whispered, "Take care of everything, John, you'll know what to do." At the time, I thought he meant the estate, the business decisions, the practical matters of death. But now I wondered if he'd known, if somewhere in his failing mind, he'd understood what Vanessa was doing and was trusting me to make it right. Whatever it took, I would make it right. The will reading took place in Martin's conference room on a gray Thursday afternoon. Vanessa arrived early, dressed in black again, though the funeral had been over a week ago. She'd brought her mother, Catherine, who looked uncomfortable and kept glancing between her daughter and me like she sensed something was wrong. They sat on one side of the long oak table. I sat on the other, Martin at the head. Vanessa's expression was composed, confident. She thought she knew how this would go. She thought she'd won. Martin opened his folder, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. The legal language was dense, formal, but the meaning was clear. After specific bequests to various charities and a token $50,000 to any stepchildren, the entirety of Richard's estate properties, investments, and remaining cash assets was left to me. I watched Vanessa's face, watched the confidence drain away, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. "That can't be right," she said, her voice sharp. "Richard changed his will. He told me he was leaving me the house, the investment accounts, everything. We discussed it." Martin didn't look up from the document. "This will was executed 7 years ago and has never been amended. It remains valid and legally binding. But I was taking care of him. I gave up everything to nurse him through his illness. Jonathan was barely there." Her voice was rising now, cracking with desperation. "This isn't fair," Vanessa, Martin said, his tone flat and cold. "Fairness is not determined by your expectations. This is your father's will, and it will be executed as written." "Stepfather," I said quietly. He was her stepfather, not her father. Vanessa's eyes snapped to me, and I saw real hatred there. "You don't deserve any of this. You abandoned him when he needed you most. I was there. I sacrificed. You sacrificed nothing." I interrupted, my voice calm despite the anger burning in my chest. "You saw an opportunity, and you took it. You manipulated a dying man and stole from him." "I stole nothing." She was on her feet now, her mother pulling at her arm, trying to get her to sit down. "Everything I did was for his care, for his comfort." $1.8 million, I said, and the room went silent. "That's how much you transferred out of his accounts in 6 months. Care to explain where it all went?" Her face went white. Catherine looked at her daughter in confusion and horror. Martin placed another folder on the table. "We have bank statements, transfer records, and property purchases in your name. We have testimony from your father's medical providers that the actual cost of his care was a fraction of what you claimed. We have evidence of systematic financial elder abuse." Vanessa stared at the folder like it was a snake. "You can't prove anything. I had power of attorney. Everything I did was legal." "Power of attorney is not a license to steal," Martin said. "It's a fiduciary responsibility. You violated that responsibility. And as of now, I've referred this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." That's when she broke. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed back into her chair, her hands covering her face. Catherine was crying. "No, we too," asking her daughter if it was true, begging for an explanation. But Vanessa had no explanation, no defense. She'd been caught, completely and irrevocably, and she knew it. "The will reading is concluded," Martin said. closing his folder. Jonathan, we'll begin the estate settlement process next week. Vanessa, I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel. You're going to need it. I stood up, looked at Vanessa one last time. She was sobbing now, her careful mask completely shattered. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a deep, bone-tired sadness that it had come to this. My father trusted you, I said quietly. That's the part I'll never understand. He gave you a place in our family, treated you with kindness and respect, and you repaid him by robbing him while he was dying. I walked out of that conference room and didn't look back. The criminal investigation moved quickly. Once the district attorney saw the evidence, Vanessa was charged with financial elder abuse, theft, and fraud. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested. The case was too clear-cut, the evidence too damning. It went to trial 6 months later, and I testified, sat on the stand and walked the jury through every document, every transaction, every lie. Vanessa was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered full restitution every penny she'd taken, plus interest and penalties. Her assets were seized, the Florida property, the car, and her investment accounts. It still didn't cover everything she'd stolen, but it was something. Catherine divorced her shortly after the verdict, told me through tears that she'd had no idea what her daughter had been doing, that she was ashamed and horrified. I believed her. Catherine had been a kind woman, if somewhat blind to her daughter's true nature. She moved out of state, trying to escape the scandal and the whispers. I settled my father's estate over the following year, paid off debts, distributed charitable bequests, and sold properties that no longer made sense to keep. I kept the family home, the one I'd grown up in, the one my father had loved. I couldn't let it go, even though walking through those rooms hurt. I also established a foundation in my father's name, focused on protecting elderly individuals from financial exploitation. It was funded with a portion of his estate, and it's become my mission making sure what happened to him doesn't happen to others. That the money Vanessa stole was eventually recovered, most of it at least. The restitution payments came slowly. She'd hidden some assets well, and the legal process was glacial. But Martin was relentless, and bit by bit, we clawed it back. I ran into Catherine one last time, about 2 years after the trial. She was in town visiting old friends, and we met for coffee. She looked older, worn down by everything that had happened. I know it doesn't matter, she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it, but I'm sorry for what she did, for not seeing it sooner. You couldn't have known, I said, and I meant it. She fooled all of us in different ways. Richard was a good man, Catherine said softly. He deserved better. He did, I agreed, but he also taught me to stand up for what's right, to fight for justice, even when it's hard. So, in a way, she didn't win, because everything he built, everything he valued it, survived her. We didn't stay in touch after that. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, but I carry no hatred for Catherine. She was collateral damage in her daughter's scheme, just like the rest of us. As for Vanessa, she served 3 years before being released on parole. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved across the country, changed her name, and tried to start over. I hope she learned something from it all, though I doubt it. People like her rarely do. But I learned something. I learned that trust is precious and can be weaponized. I learned that sometimes the people who cry the loudest at funerals are performing for an audience. I learned that justice, real justice, takes time and effort, and an unwillingness to let go. Most importantly, I learned that my father's legacy wasn't the money or the properties or the investments. It was the values he instilled in my integrity, perseverance, the courage to fight for what's right. Vanessa tried to steal his fortune, but she could never touch what really mattered.